What's up, y'all? Mr. Bear here with The Lightning Thief. We're on chapter 19. We're really moving along in this book. We're at a really good point, in my opinion. Right now in the book, Percy, Annabeth, and Grover have just escaped into the underworld. They're there to try to find Zeus's master bolt from Hades. And in the last chapter, they got past the three-headed dog Cerberus and bribed the boatman Charon to bring them across the river Styx. So now they really are in the underworld, and the ghouls and security forces of the underworld are out looking for them. And they're out looking for Hades and the Master Bolt. So that's where we left off yesterday. We're on page 300, the start of chapter 19. This chapter is called We Find Out the Truth. Sort of. So here we go. Imagine the largest concert you've ever seen. A football field packed with 1,000,000 fans. Now imagine a field 1,000,000 times that big, packed with people. And imagine the electricity has gone out and there's no noise, no light, no beach ball bouncing around the crowd. Something tragic has happened backstage. Whispering masses of people are just milling around in the shadows, waiting for a concert that will never start. If you can imagine that, you have a pretty good idea of what the fields of Asphodel looked like. The black grass had been trampled by eons of dead feet. A warm, moist wind blew like the breath of a swamp. Black trees. Grover told me they were poplars, grew in clumps here and there. The cavern ceiling was so high above us it might have been a bank of storm clouds, except for the stalactites, which glowed faint gray and looked wickedly pointed. I tried not to imagine that they'd fall on us at any moment, but dotted around the fields were several that had fallen and impaled themselves in the black grass. I guess that the dead didn't have to worry about little hazards like being speared by stalactites the size of booster rockets. Annabeth and I tried to blend into the crowd, keeping an eye out for security ghouls. I couldn't help looking for familiar faces among the spirits of Asphodel, but the dead are hard to look at. Their faces shimmer. They all look slightly angry or confused. They'll come up to you and speak, but their voices sound like chatter, like bats twittering. Once they realize you can't understand them, they frown and move away. The dead aren't scary. They're just sad. We crept along, following the line of the new arrivals that snaked it from the main gates towards the black-tented pavilion, with a banner that read, "Judgment for Elysium and eternal damnation. Welcome, newly deceased." Out of the back tent came two much smaller lines. To the left, spirits flanked by security ghouls were marched down a rocky path towards the fields of punishment, which glowed and smoked in the distance. A vast, cracked wasteland with rivers of lava and minefields and miles of barbed wire separating the different torture areas. Even from far away, I could see people being chased by hellhounds, burned at the stake, forced to run naked through cactus patches or listen to opera music. I could just make out a tiny hill with an ant-sized figure of Sisyphus struggling to move his boulder over to the top. And I saw worse tortures too, things I don't want to describe. Sisyphus is an ancient Greek myth of a man who was, his punishment was to try to push this boulder up the top of a hill, but every time he got near the top, the boulder would fall back down, and he'd have to start it all over again, and he just does that for eternity. So that's what Percy's seeing there in the fields of punishment. The line coming from the right side of the Judgment Pavilion was much better. This one led towards a small valley surrounded by walls, a gated community, which seemed to be the only happy part of the underworld. Beyond the security gate were neighborhoods full of beautiful houses from every period in history. Roman villas, medieval castles, and Victorian mansions. Silver and gold flowers bloomed on the lawns. The grass rippled in rainbow colors. I could hear laughing and smell barbecue cooking. Elysium. In the middle of the valley was a glittering blue lake, with 3 small islands like a vacation resort in the Bahamas. The Isles of the Blessed, for people who had chosen to be reborn 3 times and 3 times achieved Elysium. Immediately, I knew that's where I wanted to go when I died. "That's what it's all about," Annabeth said, like she was reading my thoughts. "That's the place for heroes." So there's kind of 4 levels in the Greek underworld, right? There's the Fields of Punishment. That's the really bad one. There's the Fields of Asphodel. That's just kind of for normal people. That's where everybody's standing around on grass. Those are 2. And then there's 2 good ones. There's Elysium, which is where he smells barbecue cooking and hears laughter. And then within Elysium, there's an even better one, the Isles of the Blessed. And that's for people who were chosen to be reborn 3 times and achieved Elysium all 3 times. It's for heroes. But I thought of how few people there were in Elysium, how tiny it was compared to the Fields of Asphodel or even the Fields of Punishment. So few people did good in their lives. It was depressing. We left the Judgment Pavilion and moved deeper into the Asphodel fields. It got darker. The colors faded from our clothes. The crowds of chattering spirits began to thin. After a few miles of walking, we began to hear familiar screech in the distance. Looming on the horizon was a palace of glittering black obsidian. Above the parapets swirled 3 dark bat-like creatures, the Furies. Parapets are like the towers on a castle. I got the feeling they were waiting for us. I suppose it's too late to turn back, Grover said wistfully. We'll be okay. I tried to sound confident. Maybe we should search some of the other places first, Grover suggested, like Elysium, for instance. Come on, goat boy. Annabeth grabbed his arm. Grover yelped. His sneakers sprouted rings, and his legs shot forward, pulling him away from Annabeth. He landed flat on his back in the grass. Grover, Annabeth chided, stop messing around. But I didn't. He yelped again. His shoes were flapping like crazy now. They levitated off the ground and started dragging him away from us. Maya! He yelled, but the magic words seemed to have no effect. Maya, already! 911, help! I got over being stunned and made a grab for Grover's hand, but too late. He was picking up speed, skidding downhill like a bobsled. We ran after him. Annabeth shouted, Untie the shoes! It was a smart idea, but I guess that's not so easy when your shoes are pulling you along feet first at full speed. Grover tried to sit up, but he couldn't get close to the laces. We kept after him, trying to keep him in sight as he zipped between the legs of spirits who chattered at him in annoyance. I was sure Grover was going to barrel straight through the gates of Hades' palace, but his shoes veered sharply to the right and dragged him in the opposite direction. The slope got steeper. Grover picked up speed. Annabeth and I had to sprint to keep up. The cavern walls narrowed to either side, and I realized we'd entered some kind of tunnel. No black grass or trees now, no rock underfoot, and the dim light of the stalactites above. Grover! I yelled, my voice echoing. Hold on to something! What? He yelled back. He was grabbing at gravel, but there was nothing big enough to slow him down. The tunnel got darker and colder. The hairs on my arms bristled. It smelled evil down there. It made me think of things I shouldn't even know about. Blood spilled on an ancient stone altar. The foul breath of a murderer. Then I saw what was ahead of us, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The tunnel widened into a huge dark cavern, and in the middle was a chasm the size of a city block. Grover was sliding straight toward the edge. Come on, Percy! Annabeth yelled, tugging at my waist. But that's... I know, she shouted. The place you described in your dream, but Grover's going to fall if we don't catch him. She was right, of course. Grover's predicament got me moving again. He was yelling, clawing at the ground, but the winged shoes kept dragging him toward the pit, and it didn't look like we could possibly get to him in time. What saved him were his hooves. The flying sneakers had always been a loose fit on him. And finally, Grover hit a big rock, and the left shoe came flying off. It sped into the darkness, down into the chasm. The right shoe kept tugging him along, but not as fast. Grover was able to slow himself down by grabbing onto the big rock and using it like an anchor. He was 10 feet from the edge of the pit when we caught him and hauled him back up to the slope. The other winged shoe tugged itself off, circled around us angrily, and kicked our heads in protest before flying into the chasm to join its twin. We all collapsed, exhausted on the obsidian gravel. My limbs felt like lead. Even my backpack seemed heavier, as if somebody had filled it with rocks. Grover was scratched up pretty bad. His hands were bleeding. His eyes had gone pupilled, goat style, the way they did whenever he was terrified. I don't know how, he panted. I didn't. Wait, I said. Listen. I heard something. A deep whisper in the darkness. Another few seconds, and Annabeth said, Percy, this place. Shh. I stood. The sound was getting louder. A muttering evil voice from far, far below us, coming from the pit. Grover sat up. What's that noise? Annabeth heard it too now. I could see it in her eyes. Tartarus. The entrance to Tartarus. I uncapped Anaklusmos. The bronze sword expanded, gleaming in the darkness. The evil voice seemed to falter just for a moment before resuming its chant. I could almost make out the words now. Ancient, ancient words. Older even than Greek, as if... Magic, I said. We have to get out of here, Annabeth said. Together, we dragged Grover to his hoofs, started back up the tunnel. My legs wouldn't move fast enough. My backpack weighed me down. The voice got louder and angrier behind us, and we broke into a run. Not a moment too soon. A cold blast of wind pulled at our backs as if the entire pit were inhaling. For a terrifying moment, I lost ground, my feet slipping in the gravel. If we'd been any closer to the edge, we would have been sucked in. We kept struggling forward and finally reached the top of the tunnel, where the cavern widened out into the fields of Asphodel. The wind died. A wail of outrage echoed from deep in the tunnel. Something was not happy we'd gotten away. What was that? Grover panted when we collapsed in relative safety of a black poplar grove. One of Hades' pets? Annabeth and I looked at each other. I could tell she was nursing an idea, probably the same one she'd gotten during the taxi ride to L.A., but she was too afraid to share it. That was enough to terrify me. I capped my sword, put the pen back in my pocket. Let's keep going. I looked at Grover. Can you walk? He swallowed. Yeah, sure. I never liked those shoes anyway. He tried to sound brave about it, but he was trembling as badly as Annabeth and I were. Whatever was in that pit was nobody's pet. It was unspeakably old and powerful. Even Echidna hadn't given me that feeling. I was almost relieved to turn my back on that tunnel and head toward the Palace of Hades. Almost.